just to do a quick kind of public opinion poll here to preview what's to come. Who here has heard of or knows anything about nuclear energy? Raise your hand.
I've heard of it.
50, 60%. Who here, of those that have heard of it, who here has a favorable view on nuclear energy? Okay, so if you maybe 20%. Who here has a negative view on nuclear energy? Okay, maybe 10, 20%. And then who here has no idea or barely ever heard of nuclear energy? Okay, so a few. Good. We have a little bit of variety. So we'll start with what nuclear energy is. So the idea of nuclear power, I'm not sure if anyone saw Oppenheimer recently, which is one of the big movies about nuclear. It's the use of nuclear reactions to make electricity. So we say the nuclear food is technically uranium, but there are other things you can use to create nuclear energy, like plutonium and other new novel elements that are coming out. So the basic idea is we're producing boiling water by creating steam that's going to spin a turbine, and I'll show you that in an image here coming out. And the water is heated by the fission, the nuclear fission we're going to talk about, which is where we make heat by splitting apart the uranium atom inside a nuclear reactor core. And we'll demonstrate to make it a little bit easier. So here you can see, so we start with a neutron, which turns into the nucleus. We're going to split that, and the fission product itself is going to start a cascading chain reaction, and that's how we're going to get the electricity out. So here is your typical nuclear reactor core in a power plant. I'll make it a little bit easier. So I'm sure some of you have seen this if you've ever driven through some of those, mostly in rural areas, so if you've driven through rural Ohio, Pennsylvania, or even down the south in some of the Carolinas. So here you have a typical nuclear reactor. So this is going to require a large amount of water, which we're going to talk about, typically about 1 billion gallons of water per day to run a 1 or 2 nuclear core site. So we need to be surrounded by a large cold water source, as you can imagine. This is going to be used here to heat the water like we talked about, that vapor coming out the top. And so this is all going to be connected. So then we're going to heat that water. It's going to spin a turbine, which is going to create steam, and then we're going to use that to create the electricity we talked about. So it's a self-contained system surrounded by a source of water. And we're not engineers, so we'll do our best to kind of explain how things work. So here, if you drive by, this is typically what you would see. It's typically have about 2 big nuclear reactors in the plant, and then surrounded by the different modalities to help transmit the electricity to the surrounding areas. So to give a little bit of history of how nuclear has been used and where we are today, the first plant came online in 1954 here, and then soon after in Russia in 1958. And we expanded pretty rapidly in the 50s and 60s. I think most of us know about the medical uses of different nuclear technologies, mostly in imaging and now in novel targeted therapy and oncology as well. We also are starting to use it for long distance exploration in NASA, which I found pretty unique. So right as of today, there are 92 to 96 commercial reactors online in 28 states, as I mentioned, mostly in rural areas. And that supplies about 10% of global power and 20% or 1 in 5 US businesses and homes, which I found really interesting. And interestingly enough, it provides 70% of emission-free power, so it does not emit greenhouse gases. There are 2 new plants coming online in the US, which if you look historically, it's very interesting because we have 92 today, but only 2 coming online in the next 5 or 10 years. So we're slowly phasing out nuclear in this country. However, abroad, in countries that are still developing really rapidly, like China and India, there are more than 50 coming online in the next few years. And the share, as I mentioned, is decreasing compared to renewables, which is rapidly increasing, like wind and solar. And just something I found interesting, the country that has the highest use compared to energy output of nuclear is actually France. It makes up 70% of their total power grid. So you might be asking yourself, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages to nuclear given the current political climates? So in terms of power output, it is the most reliable energy source we have in America. So when I say that, I'm not saying on a cost basis. I'm talking about in terms of power output and fulfilling the needs of the country and the grid. So it's 1.5 to 2 times more reliable than natural gas and coal, and then it's 2.5 to 3.5 times more reliable than wind and solar. Why is this? Well, it can run 24/7. It's pretty self-sustaining once it comes online. We'll talk about some of the disadvantages about some of the difficulties in getting these reactors online. And then another pro is that the nuclear fuel only needs to be refueled every 1.5 to 2 years instead of being serviced daily or weekly. And this, as I mentioned, does generate clean carbon-free electricity, no greenhouse gas emission. It has a very small land footprint. For those 1 or 2 reactors, might only require several acres or maybe up to tens of acres. instead of some of these large fields you would need for solar, which solar farms are typically 25 to 200 acres. And then it has pretty minimal waste, which we'll also talk about. In terms of disadvantages, this is where I started with the public opinion poll. The largest detractor to nuclear growth is actually public opinion. So as of last year, 51% of individuals supported growing nuclear energy as the share of our grid. And that's actually been rising in previous years. So it came up 15% the past 3 years throughout the pandemic, and we're starting to see a larger shift in favor of nuclear energy. And in terms of why that is, we can get into etiology, but it seems to be mostly just a lack of knowledge on the pros and cons, as well as the actual role that nuclear plays currently in society. So the biggest detractor outside of public opinion that I found is the construction costs. So one of the reasons nuclear energy today is so expensive compared to some other forms of energy, if you look at per kilowatt hour energy that you get out of the plants, has to do with construction costs. From the day that the plan is set for a nuclear power plant to be built, typically costs 2 to 3 times whatever the expected budget cost was. And this can be as a result of red tape, regulations, increasing land costs, etc. And because the construction can take years, up to even tens of years, depending on the locality and the rules, those costs can really compound in terms of permitting. It requires large amounts of uranium, which is not abundantly mined, and we normally have to get abroad from Argentina and the Middle East. It requires, even though it doesn't directly emit any greenhouse gases, there is greenhouse gas emission in terms of what it takes to build the plant, as well as what it takes to transport all that water, nuclear fuel, and the other components from abroad. And we're going to talk about the 1 billion gallons of water per day, which I just found as an amazing statistic to imagine 1 billion gallons of water being required for one of these reactors. Obviously, it requires a lot of long-term planning in terms of locality to avoid radiation exposure and extensive safety protocols. In terms of waste and storage, since nuclear is a very sensationalized word, and I'm sure a lot of us have heard a lot of some of the accidents in the past. Let's talk a little bit about the waste. So there are 2 main waste products we need to focus on. So there's the nuclear fuel itself that we're transporting in, and then there's also the waste component in terms of what's exposed to that nuclear reactor. So these are things as simple as the tools that the workers are using, the clothing, and all the other components that come in exposure during the reactor process. So these can be stored 2 ways. First, we can store above ground in dry cast, which I'll show you. Second, which is becoming a more novel and utilized feature, is storing them deep underground in geological disposals, where similar to the algae we talked about, where for hundreds of thousands of years it won't become an issue for the environment. This is something we'll go a little bit into. We attempted to build a large deep storage in Nevada, so this would be actually underneath the surface, but not in water. However, this was quickly voted against by the residents after 5 years of construction, due to concerns about the environment and the nearby residents. But the waste is extremely dense, so to give you an idea, if we were to stack all of the waste from the past 60 years of nuclear energy, which again runs 20% of the country, we could stack on a football field 10 feet tall, all the waste. And then, so this is to give a little bit of an idea of the breakdown. So these are the dry casts that I mentioned before if you were to store above the surface. However, as I mentioned, this requires continually monitoring, and then every 5 or 10 years you need to change sites and also check for exposure. Now, if you were to store it deep underneath the surface, typically about, I believe it's 200 feet plus, this would be your deep geological disposal. This would be sealed or open and retrievable, because presumably after hundreds of thousands of years, you would be able to recycle this nuclear energy once the nuclear radiation effect is diminished. But as of today, we currently do not have any deep geological disposal in the United States. These are those dry casts I mentioned, which have that very scary radioactive symbol. And then that is what a deep geological disposal would look like, using tunnels to get to the disposal vaults. So to give an idea of how dense nuclear energy is, the 1 uranium pellet that we would use to power a reactor is equivalent to the same surface area of 17,000 cubic feet of natural gas, 149 gallons of oil, and 1 ton of coal. So now we get to some of the scary realities of using nuclear energy, which are some of the historical accidents, which I'm sure we've heard of. So first, we'll start with Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1986. This was a series of explosions where pieces of the reactor actually ejected into the surrounding atmosphere. we don't need to get too much into the mechanism, but to jump to it, there were 134 workers, emergency responders diagnosed with acute radiation syndrome, and there were 28 fatalities within weeks. However, over the resulting years to follow, we don't actually know the full number, but the estimates are in the low thousands for total fatality count. And this is not to mention another component which we didn't write here, which is that there were hundreds of thousands of people displaced as a result of this accident, to get them away from the area, and then also to create kind of a zone that we could do more research on. And then in Fukushima, Japan, more recently in 2011, there was a giant earthquake resulting from a tsunami, which damaged a reactor cooling system, leading to meltdowns and a hydrogen explosion. Interestingly enough, there were no directly linked deaths or radiation sickness. However, they estimate over time we might see in the hundreds in terms of fatalities. And again, displacements came along with that. And then in terms of the US, we've only really had one major accident, which was in Pennsylvania, cooling system malfunction leading to radioactive fallout. However, there have been to date no direct result deaths or injuries. And as I mentioned, US plants are the most regulated and scrutinized in the world, so this may be a result of some of the better success we've had here in the US. On the left here, you'll see that's the Chernobyl site in Ukraine, and then on the right here, this is closer to the moment because it's more modern here in Fukushima, Japan, during the accident. And then I'll give it over to Kristen to talk a little bit more.
So next we'll shift into talking about the health effects of radiation exposure. So first breaking it down to the cellular level that we reviewed first year of school, but the impact of radiation on cells. So we have beta, gamma, and x-rays, and those can penetrate the skin, and the exposure has a dose-response relationship. So the more radiation that you're exposed to, the greater the extent of the effects and the harm that it can cause on cells. However, any dose of radiation can lead to a possible risk to human health. But at low exposure, the body's natural repair system can address DNA damage soon after. So we can see in the diagram here, 3 different options. First is that the cell is correctly repaired with like our innate repair mechanisms, and that causes no increased risk of cancer or anything else like that. And then the second option is that the DNA damage is so significant from the radiation that the cell will just die. And it doesn't really have, we're not really entirely sure what the effect of that be. And then the last option is the cell is incorrectly repaired. And then that is when you can have mutations that can cause significant health impacts. Next slide. So how does this impact worker health? I decided to divide this up into short-term and long-term effects. So short-term effects are actually really unlikely because the acute symptoms are associated with the radiation dose of 100 millisieverts, but the average measurable dose in a worker is 21 millisieverts. So they're not quite at that level where we would expect to see acute effects. But as John mentioned earlier, in accidents that have happened like Chernobyl, people have developed acute radiation syndrome, and that typically presents as nervousness, confusion, both of which are really extreme, as well as severe nausea, vomiting, watery diarrhea, loss of consciousness, burning sensations of the skin. And the onset would be within minutes of exposure, and then if the radiation levels within the person, the individual, lower, then those symptoms start to resolve. But it's not something that is really seen common, only in the setting of accidents. What's actually more common is the shift-related problems. So monitoring a nuclear power plant requires 24-hour maintenance, and so a lot of people that do this work night shifts, and so there have been studies that have shown that these workers, especially the ones who work the night shift, experience less alertness, fatigue, sleepiness, which can increase the risk of an accident, but that's more related to the short-term effects of working in the nuclear plant environment. And then the long-term effects, so there's an increased likelihood of developing cancer, leukemia, if the exposure to the dose of 100 millisieverts or higher. And so, however, looking at the generational impacts, 75,000 children who were born to parents who did receive high radiation doses at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they've been really closely followed after those incidents, had no increase in genetic abnormalities. So the long-term effects that we can see of radiation seem to be limited to the person that was exposed. And then just looking at the different roles within working in a nuclear power plant, there is greater exposures based on your job. So for example, contractors, their average is a little bit higher at 30 millisieverts than the utility workers, who are more at 13 millisieverts. So your role within the nuclear power plant can have an effect on the doses of radiation that you're exposed to. But as we said, acute symptoms really don't build up until about 100 millisieverts. And so then the other thing to consider is the resident health. So those who live around the area where there is a nuclear power plant. So 3 million Americans live within 10 miles of a nuclear reactor. So this does affect a lot of lives. On average, one will get more radiation over a lifetime from being around personal electronics, actually though, than from being near a nuclear power plant. So a lot of, as John mentioned, the biggest barrier to building more is public opinion, and I think that opinion might be informed by a lot of what we hear, but the reality is what the individual decisions we make to surround ourselves by. The electronics that we have are actually more significantly contributing to our radiation exposure rather than these nuclear power plants. So in 1990, the National Cancer Institute did a study which showed that there was no evidence of increase in cancer mortality among people living near these 62 major nuclear facilities. So those long-term impacts that we talked about with the cancer and leukemia that you might see in workers who work in nuclear power plants, those would not necessarily, there's been no evidence that showed that there's an increased risk of the mortality, cancer mortality, in the residents who live near a power plant. However, there are major socioeconomic and psychological impacts of radiation produced after nuclear accidents. I thought this was really interesting. A lot of it is related to displacement. So after those major accidents, because of the fear of the immediate radiation exposure, many people were immediately just taken from their homes, and this caused increased stress, anxiety, depression, substance use, suicide rates. But all of those can't necessarily be directly attributed to radiation exposure. It's more due to just the trauma of being displaced and the rhetoric around those things. Next slide. So looking into the future, so as we know, the world population is rapidly growing. It's expected to be 9.7 billion by 2050. And so with the rise of urbanization, our world is facing increasing energy demands. So the benefits of nuclear energy is that of the energy sources, it emits the lowest amount of CO2 equivalent per unit of energy with, as we've discussed, limited negative health effects. So looking into the future, it does suggest that it's a sustainable option to continue to increase in demand, or as we increase in demand in energy, it would be a sustainable future energy system to turn to. And as John mentioned earlier, many countries outside the US are starting to embrace nuclear energy, and so while it's kind of stagnating within the US, it's growing in other places. And these countries are reprocessing used nuclear fuel, which actually reduces the waste and extracts 25 to 30% more energy than non-reprocessed fuels. So it's a better option for the environment. Another option is to start pairing renewable plants with nuclear as a baseload, nuclear energy as a baseload power, and so that is an option of making this more sustainable as well. Another thing that's come out recently is small modulator reactors, which are advanced nuclear reactors that have a power capacity that's about 1/3 of the generating capacity of a traditional nuclear power reactor. And these address a lot of the disadvantages that we discussed earlier of nuclear energy because they can produce a large amount of low carbon electricity. They're cheaper. You can make them off-site, and so one of the barriers we discussed was the construction and the chaos that causes, and so we can make these really easily off-site and then just drop them into the new location, and they take up less room within the community compared to the traditional ones. They also have a longer core life and are great for emergency. There's like an emergency response button. And then finally, there's a lot of research looking into nuclear fusion versus fission. So fission is when it releases energy when atoms are split, and then fusion is the opposite. It releases energy when atoms are joined. So we know that the fusion reaction releases more energy than fission, but fusion doesn't produce as many harmful long-term radioactive waste products that fission does. And so fusion needs more energy to accomplish this than fission does, but this is just an active point of research that hopefully maybe we can utilize looking into building up the nuclear energy systems. I think that should be all. Yeah, and these are our references. Thank you.
Can we go back to this slide that